Hello everyone and welcome to this episode for the Bicester School History Department. This is a video for AQA GCSE History, specifically for those students studying the Conflict and Tension in Asia module. Now it will use the Conflict and Tension in Asia booklet, which is available to download from the school website. The link is in the description. The purpose of these videos is to give you some pointers on some key areas, as well as advice on how to answer some of the questions. I'd continue to pause and use this video as you work through the booklet. Email any teachers, your teachers, for any more specific advice or help, and make sure to continue to check ePraise for any specific tasks. In today's episode, we're going to continue to look at the Vietcong and American tactics in the Vietnam War. Hopefully, last episode, you've seen how the war began and how it escalated through the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Now, the Vietcong tactics were specifically designed to avoid a direct battle. They used a tactic called guerrilla warfare. This meant that they could take on the American army, because if they took them head on, the Americans were too powerful. They had too much money and weaponry that would destroy the Viet Cong. So they used this guerrilla warfare tactic. They fought in ambushes and in small skirmishes to try and avoid that head-on fight. Now, they hoped to wear down the Americans and destroy their morale in fighting. One of the key aspects to this is that the Viet Cong didn't wear a uniform. They weren't identified as soldiers. Instead, they posed as peasant villagers, and they lived in the villages in Vietnam. They were farmers by day and soldiers by night. This made it was really hard for the Americans to tell the difference between who was a Viet Cong and who was a peasant. Now, this meant that by working in the villages, the peasants would support the Viet Cong. But if they didn't, the Viet Cong would threaten the villagers. So it isn't 100% one way. The Viet Cong used ambushes and traps to try and catch the American troops who were on patrol. An example of these traps is they would sharpen bamboo sticks, bury them in the ground, and then cover them up with sticks and leaves. So when the Americans walked over them, they would step through and find a rather painful thing to step on. In order to get their supplies, the Viet Cong would use secret underground tunnels. And they would use these to move supplies and people around. They would often also live down there at points as well. One of the most important trails and tunnel networks was called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And this was a pathway that linked the North Vietnam, the communist part of Vietnam, to South Vietnam. And it transported guns and ammunition from the north to the south. And there was a special team of Viet Cong who was tasked to keep it open 24 hours. See if you can have a go at task 13. To give you a bit of help, the poster is a Viet Cong made poster and it's supporting them. Look in the picture. Who are the good guys and who are the bad guys? Now we've looked at the Viet Cong tactics, let's look at the American tactics. And there were three main tactics. The first was the one that we mentioned last time. This was the intense bombing of North Vietnam and Vietcong targets. It was called Operation Rolling Thunder. It aimed to bomb the Viet Cong into submission and disrupt their supply routes. It was, to an extent, effective. In 1969, it did mean that the Viet Cong had to start negotiating with America. But the cost of this tactic was enormous. An American magazine estimated that it cost $400,000 just to kill one Viet Cong soldier. This included 400 artillery shells and 75 bombs. Have a go at task 14. There's a question in there that is about your opinion. So just write down what you think. There's no right answer there. The next tactic used by the Americans was chemical weapons. These were dropped from a plane, like the bombs. However, there were two different kinds. There was Agent Orange, which is a defoliant. It's essentially a giant weed killer. It was used to get rid of the jungle so that the Viet Cong couldn't hide in it. However, this caused skin burns and birth defects. You can see in the picture to the right. It also wiped out 4 million acres of forest and farms, which affected 1.2 million people. The other chemical weapon used was napalm. This is a kind of oil jelly-like substance that burns for longer, and it's used to burn down villages as well as the jungle. It burned through skin right to the bone. This made little difference to the fighting. However, the human cost was immense. Over 500,000 children have since been born in Vietnam with birth defects, which can be linked to Agent Orange. Have a go at task 15. What would the American public think about when they saw images of what their armies were doing? The last American tactic was search and destroy. This was a specific targeted strike on a particular Viet Cong stronghold or target. American troops were dropped in by helicopters, and their task was often to destroy any weapons or Viet Cong items that they found, and to kill any Viet Cong that they found. This sounds like a good idea because it tried to avoid any peasant casualties. However, often the information about Viet Cong hideouts was wrong. There were inexperienced troops, and often they walked into traps. And on the times that they didn't find any Viet Cong, often innocent villagers were mistaken, and there were high civilian casualties. For every one weapon that they found, 6 people were killed. Quite often they were innocent. This increased unpopularity for the Americans. And that tactic led to 3 big problems for the Americans. Firstly, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, if they were under pressure, they could escape into North Vietnam, Cambodia and Laos. Now, the Americans couldn't follow them into Cambodia and Laos, so it meant that they had time to gain their supplies and regroup. Second of all, is at the start of the Vietnam War, most soldiers were well trained in the American army, and they were very happy with their job. However, as the war went on, more and more troops were drafted. These are people who are forced to go to the war. These people were not as engaged in the conflict. And actually, many people tried to avoid going to war. When I say people, it's young men. But this affected the quality of the troops that were fighting. And actually, many were inexperienced and disliked being there. And it's no surprise. Of the 56,000 Americans that were killed, 60% of them were between the ages of 17 and 21. And some troops took to even killing their own officers to avoid fighting. But finally, and perhaps most importantly, is that President Johnson spoke about winning hearts and minds of the Vietnamese peasants. But the US tactics led them against the peasants. And the peasants were not likely to support people and not likely to support the US Army because of their tactics. Have a go at task 16. This has got another opinion question, so make sure to explain yourself really clearly. So now we've looked at the tactics, there are two key turning points in this Vietnam War. The first of which is the My Lai Massacre. Now in 1968, 3 platoons landed near the village of Son Mai. This was thought to be a Vietcong stronghold, and so Lieutenant Calley led a search and destroy mission and ordered that everyone in the village and all resources were to be killed and destroyed. However, the information was wrong. There were no men at the village because they were all off at market, and so it was left with children, elderly, and the women. About 500 unarmed people were killed in about 2 hours. 18 months later, pictures and the story of this massacre made it into the American press. This shocked the American public. They were ashamed that their army could do something like this. And what followed was the biggest anti-war protest the Americans had seen, with 700,000 protesting in Washington. Have a go at task 17. Try and include as many specific details as you can. The other turning point was the Tet Offensive. Now this took place during a brief truce between the Americans and the Vietcong. This was over the Tet New Year holiday, celebrated in Vietnam. During this truce, the Vietcong launched a surprise attack on the Americans and targeted 100 specific cities and military targets. They expected the people to rise up against the Americans and South Vietnam's government, specifically Diem. But they didn't. The North Vietnamese and the Vietcong lost lots of trained, experienced troops, and it was a disaster for them. But it was also a disaster for the Americans. The US public was shocked. They had been spending $20 billion a year and had been caught off guard by the Vietcong. How had they been taken so much by surprise? And Walter Cronkite, who was a journalist reporting on the Vietnam War, said, "What the hell is going on? I thought we were winning the war." Walter Cronkite was seen as a very trustworthy reporter. He was often called the most trusted man in America. This turned American people against the war. Have a go at Task 18. And finally, Task 19 is based off a new style of exam question that requires two sources. We'll look at this in more depth and look at the technique needed in another episode. But for now, we're going to practice using the sources. Have a go at the questions. To give you some tips, think about the message of each source. What is the source trying to tell you? And for a bit of advice on the last question, I'd think about two things when thinking about the attitudes towards the US. What's the provenance of each source? Where does the source come from? That might give you a clue as to what it thinks about the US. Second of all, what is the purpose of each source? What is each source trying to do? Is it trying to persuade you of a particular opinion? What is it trying to do? I hope you found this episode useful in helping you complete this booklet. If you've got any more specific questions, make sure to email your history teacher. Thanks for watching.